It was one of those afternoons when the rain seems to have grown tired of falling yet has nowhere else to be. The Cherwell moved under the low bridge in slow brown spirals, carrying with it a film of sodden leaves. I sat on a damp bench, the Oxford Mail folded awkwardly against my knee, half reading, half listening to the far-off chime from St. Hilda's. The bells there have always been faint, as though embarrassed by their own persistence. The crossword was an unremarkable one, but the clue in the bottom right corner, silent witness, 6, refused to yield. I tried the usual rotations of mind. Courtrooms, spies, the statues and graveyards that seemed to watch you from the corner of an eye. Nothing settled. I sipped at the thin coffee from the kiosk by Magdalen Bridge and watched the water, waiting for the answer to rise as naturally as mist from the river. A figure in black passed along the towpath, her habit darkened to a heavy gloss by the drizzle. She gave a brief nod, the kind that suggests a memory shared only by buildings. Her face was spare and pale, though the eyes seemed warmer than the rest of her expression allowed. I noticed, without meaning to, the frayed stitching at the cuff of her sleeve, the kind of repair that speaks of private economy rather than neglect. She was gone before I could decide whether to stand and offer a greeting. The bells continued their thin music. I closed the paper and let my thoughts drift to the weeks ahead. The usual reports, the half-finished books on my desk, the small promise I'd made to myself to drink less whiskey and more water. The rain was finer now, a mist rather than a fall, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke from one of the college lodges. It was nearly 4 when my pocket stirred with the coarse buzz of the mobile. Lewis, his voice practical, but edged with the hesitancy he gets when news isn't quite routine. There'd been a death in Jericho, a small retreat house I didn't know by name. The deceased, a woman in her 50s, had once been a sister at St. Hilda's. Heart trouble, the warden said. Nothing for us, probably. But the local doctor had been uncertain, enough so that Lewis had thought to ring me before the coroner. I could have said no, could have told him to let it pass through the usual channels, but something in the air, or perhaps in the memory of that damp habit moving past me, pressed against my reluctance. I asked her name. He told me. The syllables caught somewhere between recognition and doubt. I remembered hearing it once, years ago, in a conversation about an old convent library being sold to pay for repairs. She'd been the one to pack the books. I stayed on the bench a while after the call ended. The river had taken on the color of pewter, and the bells at St. Hilda's began again, hesitant at first, then steadier, marking an hour I hadn't planned to notice. The crossword lay folded in my coat pocket, the unsolved clue still waiting. Silent witness. 6 letters. It struck me then, not the answer, not yet, but the recognition that some clues resist because they are not meant to be solved in ink. They require walking into rooms where the air has a certain weight, touching objects no one has touched in years, listening to the pause between 2 sentences when someone is deciding what not to tell you. I stood, brushing a film of rain from my trousers, and began the walk back toward the center. Somewhere in Jericho, a woman lay still in a narrow bed, the last sound she might have heard the bells from a convent across the city, and for reasons I could not yet name I already knew I would visit her. The retreat house was one of those narrow Jericho buildings where the stairwell smells faintly of damp hymnals and old plaster. A soft carpet on the landings did little to mute the creak of the boards beneath, so each step seemed to enter the room ahead of you. Lewis met me at the first-floor corridor, his face carrying that slight constraint he wears when death is near but undisturbed. No blood, no broken glass, just the quiet finality of an ended breath. Sister Agnes lay on a narrow bed under a pale counterpane, her hands folded as though for a photograph in an old parish magazine. The curtains had been drawn against the drizzle, and the air was tinged with something medicinal, though not strongly enough to cover the faint odor of candle wax. On the desk by the window, a neat stack of prayer books was aligned with the edge, a rosary coiled atop them like a patient serpent. Beside it, an envelope, unsealed and empty, addressed in a careful, deliberate hand to the prioress. St. Hilda's, Oxford. No letter within, no blotter on the desk either, though the paper bore a faint impression when held to the light. The ghost of writing, too blurred to read. I asked Lewis if he'd moved it. He shook his head. The room, he said, had been just so when they'd arrived. The warden was downstairs, making tea she clearly didn't want. I stood at the window. The glass was clouded slightly, the view onto a courtyard of wet paving stones where a solitary chair sat beneath a dripping gutter. A place to think, perhaps, or to wait for something unlikely. Later, at St. Hilda's, the bells again, though this time they were nearer, the sound filling the cloister in soft, deliberate strokes. Sister Margaret, the prioress, met us in a small parlour that seemed to have been furnished entirely from donations. A mismatched sofa, 3 armchairs of different eras, the faint smell of polished wood and old tea leaves. She was a tall woman, the kind who seemed to stand more formally than the room required. Her voice was even, her diction precise, each word placed as though on a chessboard. She told me Sister Agnes had been frail for some years, the heart mostly, but had been content here. More than content, in fact. She'd taken on small duties in the library, kept the flowers in the chapel, an order I let her speak for a while before mentioning the envelope. Her eyes did not quite meet mine when I described it. She adjusted the cuff of her sleeve. A brief movement, almost nothing, but the kind of thing you notice when someone is recalling their own part in a story. She said she hadn't known of any letter, certainly not one meant for her. The sisters rarely wrote to her formally, she explained. They saw her daily, after all. It was true enough that the convent felt like a self-contained weather system, the sort of place where each hour had its fixed season, meals taken without discussion, bells marking the passage of the day more faithfully than any clock. And within such walls, I've always thought, nothing is ever lost by accident. She offered tea, which I declined. Lewis asked after Agnes's family. There were none, she said, save for a cousin somewhere in Devon, long estranged. The funeral, she assured us, would be modest, but proper. We walked back through the cloister, our footsteps softened by the old tiles. Somewhere behind a closed door, a voice sang quietly. Not a hymn, not quite a melody, more like the hum a person makes when they are alone and believe themselves unheard. I thought of the missing letter, the way the empty envelope sat so deliberately on the desk, as if left for someone to find. Outside, the rain had eased. I lit a cigarette, though I'd promised myself I wouldn't, and watched the smoke fold into the damp air. Lewis asked what I made of it. I told him the letter might not have been meant to reach the prioress at all, or perhaps it had, and we were already too late to read it. Lewis took the more prosaic path, which in such places is often the more revealing one. He spoke with the housekeeper first, a laywoman in her 60s with the quiet efficiency of someone who could prepare tea for 20 without once glancing at a clock. Her apron smelled faintly of starch and lavender, and her voice carried that deliberate hush adopted by those who live too long in buildings where silence is prized above conversation. She told Lewis that Sister Agnes had seemed unsettled in the days before her death. Not ill exactly, no more than usual, but thinner about the eyes, distracted when spoken to. And then, lowering her voice, though no one else was near, she mentioned a visitor, a man, middle-aged, presentable, who had come the week before. He had not stayed long, but afterwards Agnes had walked in the garden for hours, despite the cold. The housekeeper had not heard his name. Visitors signed in, but the sisters handled that themselves. While Lewis continued his slow circuit of questions, I took to the garden. It lay in a square behind the main building, bounded by an old brick wall spotted with moss and lichens. Rainwater had collected in the dips of the flagstones, and the earth along the borders was dark and soft from the past week's weather. There was a small rose bed near the far wall, carefully pruned, though the season left little colour. Against one corner, beneath a bare beech tree, stood a bench of weathered oak. A brass plaque fixed to the backrest read, "In memory of Harold G. Withers, benefactor, 1972. Below, a line of poetry. Glory be to God for simple things. It was wrong. Hopkins had written of dappled things, the pied beauty of a world in flux, not the narrow comfort of simplicity. Perhaps it was deliberate, perhaps not. But the error had been made in brass, meant to endure. I ran my fingers lightly over the letters, feeling the faint burr at the edges, and stored the thought away. A wrong word can sometimes be more telling than a missing one. When I rejoined Lewis, we were invited, with visible reluctance from Sister Margaret, into a small office off the cloister. The room smelled faintly of beeswax and paper, its shelves holding neat rows of binders. The prioress stood behind a narrow desk, her hands clasped before her as though she might close the interview by folding them tighter. The convent's guest book was brought out, a thick volume bound in green cloth, the kind one associates with village fetes and small-town council minutes. The pages were ruled by hand, each entry a neat sequence of date, name, and purpose of visit. Most of the handwriting belonged to the same careful scribe, likely one of the younger sisters. Halfway through the current year, there was a small, perfect absence. One page, not torn crudely, but removed with a precision blade, leaving a smooth inner edge and no fibers adrift. The binding itself had been lightly pressed back into place, as if to discourage curiosity. The prioress noticed my gaze, but said nothing. Lewis asked, with the polite firmness he reserves for people he doesn't yet trust, whether pages were ever removed. Sister Margaret replied that sometimes they were, usually when damaged or marked accidentally. She did not meet my eyes when she said it. We were allowed to turn the remaining pages, but the rhythm of the entries told its own story. There was a date gap where the missing sheet should have been, a few days unaccounted for, neither the week before nor the week after Sister Agnes's death, recorded in any surviving form. We left the office with the sound of the bells, vespers this time, pressing faintly against the thick walls. In the corridor, Lewis asked if the missing page meant what he thought it did. I told him it meant only that someone here valued precision, in removing as much as in preserving, and that in a place ruled by silence, the absence of a record is as loud as any confession. It was in the Bodleian that the first real outline of Sister Agnes began to appear. Not the pale figure on the narrow bed, but a younger woman with ink on her fingertips and dust in the lines of her hands. In the archive's quiet back rooms, those places where the air is always a fraction cooler and time has been slowed by the weight of paper, an elderly librarian remembered her well enough. A precise worker, he said, though her patience had limits when confronted with disorder in the catalogues. She had been liked, if not warmly, and she possessed a remarkable memory for the provenance of books, especially those acquired through private donation. The librarian, whose name I did not catch, leaned in slightly, lowering his voice despite the absence of anyone in our shot. A woman who knew too much about certain donors, he said. There was a pause as if he'd tasted something metallic on his tongue. Old men and their careful gossip. It often drips into the silences more than the sentences. From there it was a short walk to St. John's, where Dr. Julian Cross kept his rooms. Cross was the sort of historian whose charm lay in a mixture of genuine erudition and a faint theatricality. The careful way he lit his pipe, the small bow of his head when listening, as though you were giving him something to place in a locked drawer. We sat in a book-lined study whose air carried the sweet dry scent of old tobacco and the faint perfume of leather bindings. Yes, he remembered Agnes. They had met not long ago, here in Oxford. She had telephoned, out of the blue, to arrange it. They had spoken, he said, of old times in the Bodleian, of the strange pleasures of archival work, of donors long dead. Nothing more. His voice carried the lightness of a man recalling a walk in a familiar garden, but there was a weight in his phrasing that did not match the claim of innocence. I asked about the week before her death. He looked briefly at the carpet, a plain red wool worn pails where visitors had stood for decades. Only then did he say, yes, perhaps it was that week, though he could not be certain of the day. She had seemed well enough, a little tired perhaps. They had not spoken for long. He did not remember what she had been wearing. The habit, presumably. The guest book came into the conversation with the inevitability of a piece sliding into its place on the board. I mentioned, without detail, that a page had been removed from the convent's records. A faint, almost imperceptible shift in his posture. The pipe set down a fraction too carefully, the eyes not lifting from the small square of carpet at his feet. "You think I signed it?" he said after a moment, and the phrase was half a question, half an accusation. I told him I thought nothing yet, except that people rarely look at their shoes unless they are thinking about where they have been. He smiled then, that small academic smile, meant to suggest both understanding and dismissal. Agnes, he insisted, had wanted nothing more than to recall the scent of the Bodleian stacks and the way the light fell in Duke Humphreys on a winter afternoon. Old times. Nothing to trouble the present. We parted at the porter's gate. Cross returned to his rooms with the slow, deliberate steps of a man retracing them in his head. Making certain of each, I walked back toward Broad Street, the sky darkening over the spires, the bells from St. Mary's striking the half-hour. Somewhere between the Bodleian and St. John's, Agnes had carried with her knowledge of certain donors, knowledge that had survived the years, that had been worth meeting to discuss, and now there was a missing page in a convent guest book, and a historian who looked at the floor when its absence was mentioned. The shape of the shadow was still unclear, but it had begun to move. The name on the brass plaque in the convent garden, Harold G. Withers, had been rattling faintly in the back of my mind since I'd first traced its misquoted Hopkins. It was Lewis who found the thread to pull. In the university's own archives, among the dry ledgers and committee minutes, there sat a thin file marked Withers, H.G., Bequest, 1972. The papers were ordinary enough in appearance, typed on coarse cream stock, the ink faded just enough to suggest they'd been read a handful of times over the years and then left in peace. The will left a substantial sum to St. Hilda's convent, not directly, but through a trust administered by the college bursar. The details were couched in that particular legal English designed to keep the reader conscious, but not necessarily enlightened. It was Lewis who caught the name on the final page, Executor Dr. Julian Cross. The date aligned neatly with his early academic years, a time when one could imagine a bright young historian being flattered into the role. He'd never mentioned it when we'd spoken of Agnes, though perhaps that was omission by habit rather than intent. We went back to the convent that afternoon. Sister Margaret received us in her office with the same composed manner as before, though there was a flicker, the smallest strain at the edge of her smile. When I asked about the bequest, she insisted the funds had been used entirely for the upkeep of the property and the care of the sisters. Repairs to the chapel roof, the installation of a new heating system in the late 70s, the ongoing maintenance of the garden. All properly accounted for, she said, and there was an echo of the phrase in her voice, as if she'd repeated it to herself many times before. It was possible she spoke the truth, but I have known places where truth and propriety run parallel, yet never quite touch. Money, once it passes through enough hands, can be made to carry many disguises. In Lewis's more practical mind, the matter began to take the shape of a motive. Perhaps Sister Agnes, in her careful hours with the convent's records or in conversation with old friends in the Bodleian, had stumbled upon some irregularity. An expense that didn't fit the repairs claimed, a beneficiary whose name had been quietly obscured. If she'd wished to expose it, the missing letter to the prioress might have been her first step. It was neat, too neat. Motives that fit too comfortably into the boxes we prepare for them often end up belonging elsewhere. Still, we followed it for the moment. Red herrings are not always red at first sight. Back at the station, Lewis unearthed an old article in the Oxford Mail from 1972. A brief obituary for Withers, describing him as a modest man of literary interests and quiet philanthropy. No mention of family, only a passing line about his lifelong friendship with the academic community. Cross's name appeared nowhere, though the executor's role seldom makes the news. I walked home in the drizzle, my coat collar turned up against the wind, thinking of Agnes in her archive room. The way the past might have come alive in her hands, the scent of paper older than herself, the names written in fountain pen on donor slips. It was not hard to imagine her seeing something she should not have seen, something so small and so old that most eyes would pass over it. Yet even as the thought settled, it loosened again. Money is motive enough for many, but in Agnes's world, a cloistered life with no private income, no possessions beyond what could be kept in a single room, the temptation would not have been for herself. If she had sought to uncover a wrong, it would have been on behalf of someone else, or for the sake of the truth itself. And truth, I've learned, is a less reliable ally than greed. By the time I reached my flat, the streets shone with the kind of reflective darkness that makes every light seem further away. Somewhere in the quiet, a bell struck 7. I thought again of the plaque in the garden and the wrong word carved in brass. Errors have a way of revealing more than facts, if one waits long enough for their shape to emerge. It came to me one evening, without ceremony, as most small victories do. I was at my desk, the day's notes scattered in loose disorder, the rain stippling the dark window. The Oxford Mail crossword lay folded beside the cold remains of a cup of tea. Silent witness. 6 letters. I had tried every metaphor I could summon, every courtroom image and poetic turn. But the answer, when it finally presented itself, was not metaphor at all. Statue. It was obvious once seen, in the way only belated clarity can be, a thing that watches without sight, hears without listening. I wrote it in with a dull pencil, the letters pressing too deeply into the paper. The following morning we were back at Sand. Hilda's. The bells marked our arrival in their small, hesitant way, and the cloister was cool and still under a pale sky. It was then I noticed her. Saint Hilda herself, cast in stone at the corner where 2 walks met. The figure was weathered almost to softness, the once sharp lines of her veil blurred by decades of rain. Yet the face held a strange endurance, the eyes downcast as if to preserve some private understanding. It was her feet that caught me. The left bore the same erosion as the rest of the figure, a gentle dissolution of detail, but the right, a sand-colored patch, the edges still sharp, the stone a shade paler. It had been repaired recently and with some skill. I stood before it longer than was polite. A young novice, passing on some errand with a tray of folded linens, paused and told me that the repair had been done just last week. There had been a crack, she said, small but growing worse in the frost. A man from the city had been brought in, the kind who did such work for the colleges. She went on without invitation, her voice carrying that faint note of pride found in those who have seen something change in a place where almost nothing does. The repair had been finished in a day, she said, though the cloister had been closed for the work. No one had been allowed near. Lewis, who had been listening from a few paces away, came to stand beside me. "You think something could have been hidden in there," he said, low enough not to be heard by the novice. I told him I thought only that statues, like people, sometimes contain more than they reveal. We walked the length of the cloister in silence. My eyes kept drifting back to the pale patch of stone, the seam so fine it was almost invisible. The mind plays tricks when it wants to. I imagined the hollow sound of chisel on inner space, the weight of a small object sealed inside, the knowledge of its presence borne quietly by those who had arranged it. The prioress appeared from one of the side doors, her hands folded in front of her habit. She asked if we had found anything of interest. Lewis said we were merely admiring the craftsmanship. She gave the statue a brief glance, as if reminded of an ornament she had long since stopped seeing, and led us on toward the parlor. We spoke no more of it that day. But as we left, crossing the small courtyard toward the gate, I turned once more to look. The pale foot, the repaired stone, the shadow it cast across the worn flagging. In the long memory of such places, a week is hardly any time at all, and yet it was enough for something to be hidden or revealed if one knew how to look. He refectory at Scient. Hilda's had the air of a place unchanged in half a century. The same pale walls, the same long tables polished by thousands of elbows, the same smell of boiled vegetables clinging faintly to the air. Lewis and I had been left there while the prioress attended to some matter in the chapel. A pot of tea sat between us, cooling gently, and the distant clink of crockery echoed from the kitchen. It was not my intention to overhear, but the acoustics of the room were odd, the arched ceiling carrying sound from one corner to another with disorienting clarity. Two sisters, their heads close together at the far end of the room, were speaking in voices meant to be private. One mentioned a letter, the other a man. The phrases came in fragments, borne across the stillness like scraps of paper in a slow wind, before she took her vows. Not since the early years. She kept them hidden. When they noticed me looking idly in their direction, the conversation dissolved into the rustlers of aprons and the measured pace toward the door. Lewis raised an eyebrow. "Old flame," he said, in that tone of his which hovers between jest and the suggestion of serious work to come. The trail led, through a combination of catalogue searches and quiet inquiries, to the convent library. Among the few shelves of secular poetry sat a slim volume by Benedict Shaw, an Oxford poet whose reputation had faded into the dust of literary supplements from the 70s. Inside the front cover, in a careful hand, was written, "To A," who knew these words before they were written. B, it was a line that could have been purely literary, but then most affairs begin that way. Shaw lived now in a modest terrace house off the Iffley Road, the front garden choked with rosemary and unpruned roses. He answered the door with a kind of surprised courtesy, his white hair in disarray, his jumper patched at one elbow. Inside, the air was dense with the smell of books and the faint sweetness of sherry. Yes, he knew Agnes, though he still called her by her given name, Annabel. They had met when she was working at the Bodleian. She had been quick-witted, fond of argument, impatient with mediocrity. He, by his own account, had been smitten in the quiet, persistent way of men who write verse. There had been long afternoons in coffee shops, walks through Christchurch Meadow in the pale winter light. No more than that, he insisted, though the dedication in his book suggested otherwise. When she had decided to take her vows, she wrote to him. The letter had been brief, and it had closed whatever door might have been ajar between them. He had respected it, or so he said, though his eyes moved to the window when speaking of that time, as if something in the view could shield the memory. They had not met since. I asked whether she had been in touch recently. His answer was immediate. No. He had read of her death only that morning in a small notice sent by a mutual acquaintance. The news had unsettled him, though whether from grief or the sudden return of a distant self, I could not tell. Lewis, ever the collector of possibilities, thought we might have stumbled onto motive. An old love rekindled, a past reawakened in some way that threatened others. But romance is a tempting fiction in investigation. It promises clarity where there is only fog. As we left Shaw's house, the afternoon light had thinned to that bluish grey that flattens the streets. Lewis suggested, half seriously, that perhaps Agnes had been writing to him again and the letters had gone missing. I told him perhaps, but even if that were so, the missing page in the convent's guest book seemed a more deliberate act than the silence of an aging poet. Back in my rooms that night, I took Shaw's book from my coat pocket and read the inscription again. A. Who knew these words before they were written? There are many kinds of knowledge, and some grow dangerous not because they are romantic, but because they are simply true. The rain had set in again, that steady, half-hearted drizzle that seemed to seep into one's very bones. Morse sat at his desk in the small CID office, the blinds tilted just enough to keep the worst of the grey light from settling on his paperwork. The prayer diary lay before him, slim, bound in plain black leather, the kind of thing you could pass over on a crowded shelf without noticing. It had been Lewis who'd retrieved it, tucked away in a drawer at the retreat house, its key long since missing. The pages were filled in a fine, looping hand. Not quite calligraphy, but graceful. Agnes's words were those of a woman used to addressing herself to someone who never answered aloud. The entries were undated. That bothered him. Morse liked time. Even when he didn't have enough of it, he liked knowing where he was in it. But this was a drifting current of thought. I've seen the stone opened and the silence within. They think me meek, but stone remembers. A few pages on, the letter they cannot burn will outlive the tongue that speaks it. Morse turned the phrase over in his mind. Stone. Letter. Silence. It tugged at the crossword solver's itch at the back of his school. When Lewis came in with 2 mugs of tea, one strong, one suspiciously pale, Morse took the wrong one on purpose. "You've read this?" he asked, tapping the diary. "Bits," Lewis said. "Sounds like she was hiding something." "Yes, well, people hide things every day, Lewis. From their bank managers, their spouses, their doctors, from themselves." Morse stood, restless, and stared out at the rain. "The stone," he murmured. "The repaired statue of Saint." Hilda returned to him in detail, the folds of the robe, the serene face, and the right foot. Too smooth, too new. He could almost feel the mason's chisel still warm against it. "Come on," Morse said suddenly. The mason's workshop smelled of lime dust and wet timber. The man, broad-shouldered in overalls flecked with white, looked up from a slab of marble. "Yes, I did some work for the convent," he said. "Prioress asked me to fix the foot on the saint. Hilda statue. Hollowed out, someone had been at it years back. We just sealed it proper this time." "Hollowed out?" Lewis said, eyebrows climbing. The mason shrugged. "There was something inside when I found it. Not my business. Sister Margaret told me to leave it as it was. She'd see to it." "What did it look like?" Morse asked. The mason frowned, as if trying to decide whether his memory was worth sharing. "Small packet. Envelope, maybe. Wrapped in waxed cloth. I didn't touch it. Not my place." They thanked him and left. In the car, Lewis broke the silence. "So whatever Agnes saw, the stone opened, it must have been that packet. She knew about it. Wrote about it, and someone," Morse said, "saw to it that she'd never say more. Convenient that the prioress got to it before we did." They drove in silence for a while, wipers ticking back and forth. Morse thought about the letter in the missing envelope, the one never sent to Sister Margaret. The guest book page torn out, a benefactor's will from decades ago, threads, all leading toward something small enough to fit in a hollow statue's foot. Back at his flat that evening, Morse poured himself a measure of Glenfiddich and set the diary beside his chair. He read the last entry again. The same calm, deliberate hand. They think the convent holds me in silence, but my silence is my will. If the stone speaks, it will not be to them. He closed the book, letting the words settle. Agnes had not been meek. She had been waiting. And somewhere, in Oxford's rain-washed streets and cloisters, someone else was making sure the stone never spoke again. Morse leaned back, the taste of whiskey lingering. The rain tapped against the window like an impatient. The afternoon light slanted low across Christchurch Meadow, giving the air a faded gold that seemed to settle on everything like a fine dust. Morse sat again on the memorial bench, its worn teak cool beneath his palm. He reread the inscription. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It gathers to a greatness, like the ooze of oil crushed. Only that wasn't quite Hopkins, was it? Morse had first read God's grandeur as a sullen sixth former, forced into piety by a master who thought poetry could redeem adolescent cynicism. The correct line was, like the ooze of oil crushed. No, wait. He frowned. Hopkins had written, like the ooze of oil crushed. This bench said, as the ooze of oil crushed. One word, a mere shift from like to as, and yet the simile became assertion. Not something compared, but something confessed. The change altered the tone, no longer an observation of divine beauty, but a guilty admission, almost a statement of cause and effect. It was deliberate. Morse was sure of it. Lewis arrived, slightly breathless, a paper bag of sandwiches in hand. Bursar at Saint. Hilders says the 1972 bequest was perfectly above board. Wants to know if we're accusing the college of theft? Not yet, Morse murmured, eyes still on the bench. Who installed this memorial? Lewis unwrapped his sandwich. Records say it was put up by a doctor. Julian Cross, on behalf of the estate of Sir Michael Henslow. The benefactor, Morse allowed himself a small, humourless smile. Executor of the will, college historian, and amateur stone-cutter of quotations. Quite the portfolio. The sandwich crinkled. What's so important about a wrong word? Wrong words, Morse said quietly, are often the truest clues. He stood, brushing crumbs of autumn leaves from his coat, and began walking toward the Bodleian. The question had been gnawing at him, since the moment the librarian had spoken of Agnes knowing too much about certain donors. If Henslow's generosity came with strings, or secrets, Agnes might have stumbled across them while cataloguing. In the Bodleian's Special Collections reading room, Morse leafed through the archive of Henslow's personal papers. Much of it was dull. Minutes of committee meetings, hunting lodge invitations, polite correspondence in the formal hand of an English gentleman. But then, folded inside a sheaf of Christmas cards, he found a letter dated 1950 from a woman in Banbury. Its tone was neither romantic nor businesslike. Something stranger, more personal. I ask only that the child be given every chance in life. I will not trouble you further. No name for the child, no response from Henslow in the file. But Morse didn't need one. He thought of Agnes. Born around that time, raised, according to the convent's file, in an Oxfordshire orphanage before taking her vows in her 20s. If the benefactor had fathered an illegitimate daughter, the bequest might well have been meant for her. And if Cross, as executor, discovered this. Lewis found him in the reading room, bent over the letter. More secrets? Possibly the whole story. Morse slipped the letter back into its folder with the care of a man returning a loaded pistol to its drawer. Agnes may have been Sir Michael's daughter, which means this. He tapped the edge of the file. Wasn't charity at all. It was restitution. Lewis frowned, and Cross would have known. As executor, he would have known everything. The missing page from the convent guest book now felt less like an oddity and more like a deliberate excision, one that erased the record of a meeting between Agnes and Cross. "And the letter in the statue's foot?" Lewis asked. "Proof," Morse said simply. "Proof they couldn't burn, so they hid it, until someone decided it needed to disappear." Outside, the wind stirred the trees, and a scattering of leaves drifted over the bench with its altered line of poetry. A silent epitaph, perhaps, for more than one life. Morse, looking back at it through the Bodleian window, felt the faintest pulse of certainty. The past was about to speak, even if only in a whisper. Question. Lewis had never liked the historian's office. Too much oak, too much leather, too many books arranged as if for a photograph. Dr. Julian Cross sat behind his desk, jacket off, but tie perfectly knotted, an expression that tried for calm and failed. "I've already told you," Cross began. "My dealings with Sister Agnes were purely historical," Morse cut in, his voice as dry as the sherry glass on the mantelpiece. "Forgive me, Doctor, but you've been curating history rather selectively." Lewis laid a single sheet of photocopied university records on the desk. "Executor of the 1972 estate. You signed off the transfer to St. Hilda's Cross glanced at the paper, then, unhelpfully for his case, glanced away again. Morse's eyes caught it, the little betrayals of body language. "What was in the letter, Doctor?" Morse asked softly. "I don't know what—" "You do," Morse said, leaning forward. "Sister Agnes showed it to you. Proof she was the illegitimate daughter of the benefactor. Proof the bequest was hers by right, and you, guardian of the estate, couldn't allow that." Not with the college's name attached, Cross looked at the carpet. The room seemed suddenly smaller. "It wasn't like that," he said finally. "She didn't want the money for herself. She said she wanted the truth acknowledged. A name in the archives, perhaps. I thought it would destroy people still living, and the prioress—" He stopped. Morse's eyebrow arched. The prioress knew. Cross gave a small nod. "I took the letter from her desk at the retreat house. I didn't destroy it. I couldn't. I hid it. Somewhere no one would think to look. The statue," Lewis said quietly. Cross's eyes flickered. "Yes, in the foot. I had it repaired under the pretext of weather damage. It was safe there until the prioress had it removed," Morse finished. "No record, no evidence, no scandal. Just a silent witness back on her plinth." Cross's voice dropped. "She told me it was for the peace of the order. But you're right, of course. It was for the college's reputation, and perhaps mine." Morse said nothing for a long moment, studying him as if he were another piece of statuary. Then he stood. "You'll give Lewis a full statement. Every detail, dates, names, even the ones you'd prefer to forget." Cross opened his mouth as if to object, then closed it again. "I suppose I owe Sister Agnes that much." Outside, Lewis let out a slow breath. "You think the prioress will talk?" Morse's gaze wandered to the spire of St. Hilda's rising above the rooftops. "No. She'll quote scripture about truth setting us free, and then she'll tell herself that silence is a kind of mercy." They walked in silence for a few minutes, boots clicking on the damp flagstones. "You believe her, then?" Lewis asked at last. "I believe she thinks she's right," Morse replied, "which is the most dangerous sort of conviction. He did not say, though he thought it, that some truths were like letters in stone, visible to those who knew where to look, but best left unread by the rest. The following Monday morning, the case file on Sister Agnes lay on Morse's desk at Kidlington HQ. A thin sheaf of typed statements, photocopied letters, and his own scrawled notes. It looked pitifully slight for all the hours it had consumed. Lewis stood in the doorway, mug of tea in hand, watching his chief leaf through the papers without enthusiasm. "The CPS say there's no point," Lewis said at last. "No evidence of theft they can use in court? No proof anyone tampered with her medication or, well, anything else?" Morse didn't look up. "So the prioress and doctor Cross go back to their comfortable routines. And Sister Agnes remains, what, a footnote in the order's history?" Lewis shrugged. "Her death was natural, sir. Coronary thrombosis, according to the post-mortem. Might be that she just went." Morse closed the file and set it aside. "People don't just go, Lewis. There's always a reason. It's simply that sometimes the reason doesn't fit neatly into the law's boxes." They let the matter drop, officially. The diocesan solicitor would keep the letter locked away in some ecclesiastical archive. The convent would continue to accept bequests from pious widows. In a year or two, no one would remember Sister Agnes had ever questioned her inheritance or her identity. By late afternoon, Morse was at the King's Arms, alone at his usual table near the window. Outside, the street lamps were just beginning to blur the edges of Broad Street in the November dusk. He cradled a glass of claret, staring at the deep red swirl as if it might resolve into an answer. He thought of the prioress's face when she'd said, "to protect the peace of the order." It had not been the face of a woman at peace. He thought, too, of Dr. Cross, his immaculate cuffs, his careful diction, breaking into a stammer when the letter was mentioned, and of Sister Agnes herself, smiling faintly from that photograph in the retreat house office, a woman who had taken a vow of silence yet somehow managed to speak volumes. Mercy or cruelty? He could not decide. To spare a soul from scandal was one thing, to strip it of truth was another. Agnes had died knowing her proof existed, but powerless to use it. Was that a kindness? The crossword from the Oxford Mail lay beside his glass. All but one clue filled in. Inheritance. 11 letters. He'd left it until last, thinking perhaps the answer would present itself with time. He tried succession, birthright, even legacy post, which wasn't a word at all. None quite fit. He tapped the pencil against the page, his mind returning to the repaired foot of Saint Hilda's statue, to the letter folded and pressed into its hollow like a relic. Something meant to endure, hidden from sight. An inheritance of silence. With a faint, almost bitter smile, Morse set the pencil down and pushed the crossword aside. The clue could remain unanswered. At the bar, the landlord called last orders. Morse drained the glass, reached for his coat, and stepped out into the chill evening. Somewhere behind him, from an open college window, a choir's rehearsal drifted faintly over the street, a harmony that rose, wavered, and dissolved into the night air. Morse listened for a moment, then turned up his collar and walked away. The evening was one of those Oxford dusks that seemed older than the city itself. The pale sky turning to pewter above the towers, the mist rising from the river, and the world slowing to a pace that made the hour feel suspended. Morse, his coat collar turned up against the damp, walked without any particular hurry along the towpath toward Saint Hilda's. He had not meant to come this way. Or rather, he told himself that. But his feet had found the familiar route as easily as a habit. The summer's green was gone now. The trees stood bare, their black branches tracing narrow, uncertain lines across the fading light. The bells began to chime. Not the full peal, just the slow, measured strokes that drifted across the water, muffled in the fog. They sounded almost tentative, as though unsure whether anyone still listened. Morse stopped. Somewhere beyond the cloister walls, hidden from him, the order went about its evening prayers. He wondered which of the sisters had taken Sister Agnes's place in the choir stalls. He imagined her, a figure in grey, standing alone in the cloister garden. The garden would be dark now, save for the faint orange glow of the lamps by the covered walk. She would have the letter in her hands. Perhaps she read it over and over before folding it, never quite bringing herself to seal the envelope. Perhaps she knew even then it would never leave the convent. The bells fell silent. The mist closed in, softening the edges of the world. Morse took a slip of paper from his coat pocket. It was creased, worn along the folds. The final crossword from that week in June, the week she died. All but one clue was filled in, his neat capitals unbroken except for the last square. Stubbornly blank. Inheritance. He had considered the answer more than once. He had toyed with possibilities, some obvious, others deliberately obscure, but none satisfied him. It was not, he suspected, a matter of vocabulary. It was a matter of truth, and truth was a word that could mean more than one thing. For a moment he stood by the low stone wall, looking down at the dark water sliding past. The paper felt strangely heavy in his hand, as if it carried not just the clue, but the entire case. The silences, the evasions, the stubborn refusal of life to arrange itself neatly like the grid of a crossword. Without ceremony, he let it go. The damp air caught it, pressed it briefly against the surface before the current took hold. It turned slowly once, twice, then slipped beneath the arches of the bridge and was gone. Morse pulled his coat tighter and turned away from the river. Somewhere behind him, the bells started again, faint, insistent, their sound drifting after him until the fog swallowed it whole. He did not look back.